As we speak, the United States President Obama is coming to the end of what will probably be his last European visit as American president. And the last major engagement has been with Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. It's very, very interesting to see the very different approaches he adopted to the German Chancellor on the one hand, very encouraging, very reinforcing, and really the approach that he adopted to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Cameron, almost lecturing him like a little boy who needed encouragement. Despite the fact that in public relations at least, there is a special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. But no matter what his stylistics, what the president was trying to say was that the United States was interested very much in cooperation with a strong Europe. For there to be a strong Europe, there had to be a unified Europe. And the divisions of Europe today seemed to the president to be major weaknesses that would not allow a strong alliance between Europe and the United States to function properly within an international relations of great difficulty. So the diplomacy of his visit was one of trying to re-establish a certain level of strength in the Western, in the North Atlantic alliance, in the relationship between the two great land masses on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. This kind of leading role where an American president tries to unite Europe is something which would have seemed very, very odd in the early days of the foundation of the United States. The United States made a declaration of independence as its revolution began in 1776. In fact, that was hardly really the start of the United States. They took until 1789 before George Washington actually became the first recognized president. The adoption of the Constitution, the adoption of the Bill of Rights, all of these things we associate with the United States all took many years after 1776 before they became actualities. And the entity we know as the United States actually took a long time to come together. The landmass of the United States meant that by 1803 they had to conduct what they called the Louisiana Purchase, that is, buy Louisiana from France. And that doubled the size of geographical United States. They had to force Spain to cede or give them Florida in 1819. They unilaterally annexed Texas in 1845, the great battle against the Mexicans, the stand of the settlers at the Battle of the Alamo. All of that was a war that led to annexation. The war with Mexico continued. In 1848, the United States added California, Arizona, and New Mexico, seized from Mexico to the United States political and geographical landmass. The United States bought Alaska from Russia in 1867, annexed Hawaii in 1898, and could have taken over the Philippines and Puerto Rico as well, possibly even Cuba after it won its war with Spain, but kept all of those territories at some arm's length, except in the case of Cuba, where they basically occupied and continue to occupy to this day a small part of Cuba around Guantanamo Bay, which is why they're able to have their naval base and a prison camp in exactly that part of Cuba, which otherwise is an independent territory, an independent country. But really, despite all kinds of wars in Latin America, despite the Monroe Doctrine of the 19th century, basically declaring Latin America off limits to European expansionism, declaring that as part of the backyard of the United States and its independence as part of the interests of the United States, for which the United States was prepared to project power to protect, to prevent any other kind of great power from setting camp in Latin American territories. Apart from that, the United States did seem to conduct a form of splendid isolation. It wasn't particularly interested in European wars, for instance, and it really took the World War I before the United States once again found itself propelled, projected into a quarrel far away from its own shores. This was not just Latin America, this was the other side of the Atlantic, and without the American military presence in Europe in the First World War, it would have been very doubtful whether or not the British and its other allies could have successfully defeated the Germany of that particular point in time. As I said, the devastation of World War I was such that the United States, Europe, as it looked at itself, they were horrified by the carnage that they had caused with a weaponry at such a high technological sophistication that they had never exploited before, and the results of that exploitation took their breath away. The peace negotiations, the peace treaties, the projected discussions, debates and arguments as to what should happen to refashion Europe basically led to such disagreement that the American president Woodrow Wilson, at great cost to his health, went over to Europe, spending some months there, becoming the first American president actually to visit Europe while still American president, to take charge of the basic principles by which the peace of Europe could be negotiated and the international relations of the world after World War I could be constructed. The League of Nations was formed. The concept of open diplomacy was established, or so Woodrow Wilson thought. The idea that there should be certain principles of international conduct which favored democratic outcomes and pluralism and the rights of citizens, that became part of the mantra of American policy at that point in time. Has been problematic from the beginning. It remains problematic to this day, because who is to police this doctrine of these principles? What part within the world of diplomacy do these principles play? How far can you go to project your state interests while still saying that you're projecting instead the protection of certain ideals and certain principles? And where did this leave the rest of Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom? In the wake of this initiative on the part of a dedicated US president who was determined to reshape the world, including the world of Europe, in a certain way. Really, I think that the United Kingdom in particular continued to labor underneath all kinds of delusions about its power until after World War II. And again, as a result of World War II, as a result of the carnage of World War II, the result of World War II depended once again on the intervention of the United States, its military power to rescue the Western European allies. It also depended very, very much on the heroic sacrifice of the Soviet Union and the Russian peoples in confronting the Nazi threat on their front. But it meant, because you had these two great power blocs, the Soviet bloc fighting the Nazis from that side of Europe, the Western Europeans, particularly the United Kingdom, supported by the United States, fighting Nazi Germany from that side of Europe, it meant a post-war Europe that was divided between an Eastern and a Western camp. And this seemed to configure the entire international relations of the post-war world. It led to the beginnings of what we call the Cold War. Within this Cold War, this jostling for position, the major casualty in terms of the country that once was a world power but found it could no longer be a world power was the United Kingdom. And I think the real test of that was in the Middle East. The United States had projected its interests in the Middle East together with the United Kingdom that had overthrown a government in what we today call Iran for the sake of Western petroleum and oil interests. But the United Kingdom took a step too far in the sense of trying to roll back the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. And the United States refused to support the British, who, in concert with the French and the Israelis, the new Israeli state, tried to take the Suez Canal back from Egyptian hands. Now, the United States not only saw this movement as inflammatory, as setting off a powder keg in an already tense Middle East, But it was also preoccupied with other European problems, because 1956 was exactly the time of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. As the tanks rolled into Budapest, the US was concerned very, very much to contain the Soviet threat, to confine it to Hungary, to not let it spread further. It wasn't going to come to the rescue of the Hungarians. Other European countries opened up their borders to Hungarian refugees. In the end, there was more than 250,000 Hungarians who fled across the borders into other parts of Europe, mostly through Austria to Germany, to escape the Soviet threat. But nobody was going to rescue the country itself from Soviet occupation and domination. Containing the threat became the cause of diplomacy after the Second World War. It became the mantra of how the Cold War was to be conducted. Equilibrium, balance, containment. And certainly in 1956, the firefight over the Suez Canal was not going to get in the way of the United States' determination to contain conflict at all costs. But what it meant was the United Kingdom realized that if they could not succeed against an inferior enemy on the part of the Egyptians, if it could not do that with American help, then its days as a world power were rapidly coming to an end. So the United Kingdom has tried to maintain its interests as a state. It's tried to project its power as a state, but increasingly has found it's had to rely upon its European neighbors, it's had to rely on alliances with Europe, it's had to rely on a joint alliance on the part of all of Europe and the United States that is militarily devised in terms of NATO. And without these alliances, without these multilateral organizations, the United Kingdom could not survive today as an independent power. It is a power that can project itself and project its interests only in concert with others. And it's precisely in the interests of this concert of power being able to continue to project itself on a unified front that the President of the United States, President Obama, was in town, touring the different great capital cities of Europe, telling the leaders of Europe, get it together. If you don't get it together, you are nothing. If you are nothing, you will not be able to depend on United States help, because this United States is only going to help its allies that are united.